Welcome to Deleted Saves. I'm Brad, also known as Isekai Sensei-Sama, from That Time I Got Reincarnated in the Same World as an Anime Podcaster. More about me and my projects at the end of the episode. I'll be bringing you this episode's gaming goodness while Phil is taking some time off. Today, I'd like to talk to you about a recent game that was somewhat of a phenomenon, Helldivers II. Helldivers, as a franchise, is a similar take on one possible future of the human race, as we've seen previously in Starship Troopers. The games follow an elite branch of the Super Earth Armed Forces, known as the Helldivers. The role of these Helldivers is to travel to various planets and drop from orbit to take on the enemies of managed democracy. Managed democracy being a form of governance that streamlines a citizen's voting rights in service to the sovereignty of all the free peoples of Super Earth. These Helldivers are tasked with various missions, which will ultimately lead to the takeover or defense of said planets. The first Helldivers game is a co-op isometric twin-stick shooter. It gives each player a myriad of guns to choose from, as well as air and orbital strikes known as stratagems that are called in with glowing balls. Helldivers II takes this formula and expands it by changing the perspective to an over-the-shoulder third-person view with an optional first-person aiming mode. Most of the weapons, stratagems, and enemies from the first game are present in the second, with one major exception being a missing enemy faction. Speaking of enemies, I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you about who the Helldivers are fighting against. On one side of the galaxy, the Helldivers are taking on the Scourge of the Terminids, a bug-like species made up of many variants that range from the pesky, nimble hunters up to the lumbering, massive bile titans. On the other side of the galaxy, the Helldivers are taking on a more menacing threat known as the automatons. These socialist cyborgs pose a different, deadlier threat than the Terminids, as they come equipped with laser guns and a more organized and strategic army. They, too, come in many shapes and sizes, such as the abundant troopers up to the heavily armored hulks, as well as various vehicles with which to launch attacks. Conspicuously absent at the time of this episode are the Illuminate, an alien race that was driven out of the galaxy in the first game. While rumors about them abound, a true defender of managed democracy does not question the Ministry of Truth, who have made it clear that the Illuminate threat is gone forever. While all of these enemies are a threat, the Helldivers are not ill-equipped. Each Helldiver is granted access to a wide assortment of firepower, from rifles, shotguns, pistols, grenades, and other exotic handheld weapons, to deployable minefields, sentry guns, force fields, various airstrikes, and orbital barrages. Each of these weapons is a new and interesting way to take down the bots or bugs, as well as the various structures they've constructed to terrorize a planet. So where does the phenomenon aspect come into play? Well, Helldivers 2 saw some of the greatest numbers of concurrent players of any game on Steam, not even including PlayStation players, coming in only behind behemoths like PUBG, Baldur's Gate 3, and Fallout 4. And while 21st place might not seem like a big deal, the studio behind Helldivers, Arrowhead Game Studios, has never seen anything like the 450,000 concurrent players in any of their other games, with the next two closest titles, Gauntlet and Magicka, only reaching about 12,000. There's been a lot of speculation about why Helldivers 2 blew up to such a degree, but there doesn't seem to be much hard evidence for any one hypothesis. My best guess is that the satirical but seriously presented opening video and satisfying but still challenging gameplay hit the proverbial sweet spot in the current zeitgeist. Little was done to market the game, but estimates of sales between PC and PlayStation sit at around 12 million. And while that initial glut of players has fallen off significantly, it still sits comfortably in the top 40 of concurrent players on Steam at any given time. At the time of recording, it's in 30th place with 32,000 players. And as I've mentioned, this isn't just a PC phenomenon. Part of the appeal, I think, is the crossplay that is available with PlayStation. While there aren't statistics available like with Steam, I can tell you from experience that a third to half of the players you may play with at any given time are PlayStation players. But of course, we also have to talk about the controversy, and that stems specifically from the fact that this is a Sony-published title. While Arrowhead has retained all the rights to the game, Sony, as the publisher, had laid out a lot of requirements for them, one of which caused a massive backlash from players. That requirement was that a PlayStation Network account be required for all players, even on PC. While requiring a third-party account is nothing new, and we barely bat an eye at that these days, the requirement was brought front and center by a mishap that occurred and the subsequent mishandling of the tech, sales, and PR. On launch, the game was so massively popular and beyond expectations that it brought down Arrowhead's servers. In a rush to solve that problem, the requirement of the PSN account was temporarily rescinded to alleviate some of the load. While this did help solve the problem, and to Arrowhead's credit, they were able to turn around fixes in an impressively short amount of time, it made it so that new players had no idea that a PSN account was required before or would be required in the future. That alone may not have been a big deal, but as soon as the PSN account requirement was revoked, Sony started selling the game in regions where people were not allowed to sign up for a PSN account. This was all fine for a few months until Sony decided it was time to re-enable the requirement, causing potentially hundreds of thousands of people to no longer be able to play the game they paid for. As you can imagine, the outcry was immediate and massive. Players who would lose nothing, as they already had PSN accounts hooked up, left the game in droves to join the boycott. The game was massively refunded through Steam, who, being generally great with consumer rights, waived their normal 2 hours of playtime or 2 weeks return policy. Arrowhead scrambled to contain the bad PR, and in a lot of ways fumbled that communication. But in the end, the PSN account policy was rescinded, and the fervor died down. That isn't the end, though, as in the following weeks, people would notice the game being delisted in countries where a PSN account can't be created. At the time of recording, the requirement hasn't been reinstated, though the Steam store page still says that it is. Time will tell if this particular issue will become a debacle once again. But that wasn't the only controversy of Helldivers II, though it was the most widely talked about. The other, less outright problematic, but still annoying issue was and is that of glitches and balance. On the one hand, you have potentially mission-ending glitches that continue to pop up again and again, and on the other, you have an entirely overzealous game design team trying to balance weapon damage as if the game was a competitive player versus player esports title rather than a casual player versus environment cooperative wave shooter. On the topic of glitches, which is a term I'll use in favor of calling them bugs to avoid confusing them with the Terminids, they are many and varied. Arrowhead has been rushing to squash them as fast as possible, yet many still persist, and new ones pop up as some are resolved. While some of these can be viewed as hilarious, such as the environmental effects of fire tornadoes seeming to chase players around as if alive, others cause the game to crash or lock players into the mission loading screen with no recourse but to force close the game. In some correspondence, the devs have stated that some of these issues are more difficult to deal with than they appear, as the game engine they are using is somewhat old and finicky. My personal experience has been relatively glitch-free, with just the occasional stuck loading screen, though I also use a top-end PC to play, so my time with the game may not be typical. One particular issue I have been continually frustrated by, however, is that you can't stand up from prone when surrounded by enemies. Arrowhead have acknowledged this as a glitch, but it's existed on the known issues list for a long time now. It's the one issue I continue to have to deal with, as when fighting Terminids, they tend to surround you quickly, and as diving to prone is how you dodge attacks, if you get overwhelmed, there is basically nothing you can do to escape. Some may say that this is a skill issue, but my nearly 200 hours in the game so far would speak to it to being an actual problem. To round out the controversy convoy, players have been very vocal about the nerfing of weapons that was done for the sake of balance. So say the developers. Their reasoning for this was stated to be a fine-tuning of gameplay for the sake of keeping the game fair and challenging, though there were very few, if any, players who voiced content with these changes. After weeks of back and forth, the CEO of Arrowhead actually stepped down from that role to take on a more hands-on role in the game's development and to try and bring the fun back to the weapons. They since have rolled back many of the nerfs and have been more active in explaining the reasoning behind whatever changes they are making. But what of the long-term prospects of the game? Why continue to tweak the weapons? Well, one aspect of the game that I've not yet brought up is the ongoing updates through DLC-like packs called War Bonds that introduce new weapons and armor, among other things, as well as the continued world-building events called Major Orders. The Major Orders, alongside the daily personal orders, are a way for players to collectively make a difference to the state of the game map, while gaining one form of what we can call currency in the form of medals, which can be used to buy said weapons and armor from war bonds. And while war bonds must be unlocked with another form of currency, super credits, which can be bought with real money, the game is also generous in giving out those super credits in hidden places during gameplay. So anyone who plays enough could unlock all the war bonds without spending additional money. Interestingly, I've been so happy with the game that I'd like to throw a few additional bucks at them, but by the time any new war bond drops, I've always already accumulated enough super credits to unlock it. So through the use of war bonds to add content, major orders to give a sense of purpose to missions, and the addition of new missions and map types related to those major orders, Helldivers II is continually expanding its repertoire. On top of all that, as I alluded to a while ago, there is also a potential third enemy faction yet to be added. The game map has a somewhat conspicuous absence of enemy presence on one side, which is all but confirmation that we'll see some new kind of enemy at some point. And we've already seen new kinds of enemy units in the existing factions, namely a giant AT-AT-like automaton called a Factory Strider that is basically a walking automaton factory that also has a giant cannon on top. It's the kind of enemy that makes you reevaluate your entire strategy when you crest a hill and see it looming in the distance. What, then, is the key to making this a game that I want to play for tens to hundreds of hours, to spend additional money on, and to record a podcast episode about? To explain that, I've got to take you back to 2008, when a game that would define my life for years to come would come out. In late 2008, I was only months out of college and had finally moved out of my parents' house. Living with roommates, we enjoyed playing co-op games together, and one that had just come out was Left 4 Dead. I took to the game like nothing else before or since, and over many years, the release of Left 4 Dead 2, meeting my now wife, and even having a child, I played Left 4 Dead almost like it was my job. Across the two games, I've put in multiple thousands of hours. I'd dabble in some multiplayer games before, such as Counter-Strike, but I could never get invested in multiplayer games and generally stuck to story-driven experiences. But something about Left 4 Dead clicked. I believe it's probably because of multiple factors, but there are two big ones that stand out to me. First, I was proficient at the game almost immediately. I was already familiar with the movement mechanics of Valve's Source engine, and that seemed to translate well to my skill. Secondly, I found players online that I gelled with, and so I never felt like an outsider or disconnected from the experience. I think the campaign-based nature of the game was critical in that, as serious players would be together for upwards of an hour, as opposed to other multiplayer first-person shooters where matches are significantly shorter. I see now many of the same mechanics that hooked me to Left 4 Dead in Helldivers II. The way that missions span across operations, how players will get on mic to be more efficient, the way the gameplay just felt right to me almost immediately. It felt so right, in fact, that I became almost as hooked on Helldivers as I did with Left 4 Dead. From the day I bought the game until now, something like 4 months, I've only not played the game a handful of days. I find myself jumping into play whenever I've got some downtime. I've even stayed up too late a few nights to play, just like back in the day with Left 4 Dead, when I didn't have as many responsibilities. And let me tell you, that's not really something I can afford to do these days. Now, before I send you on your way and go play some more, I feel that this wouldn't really be a deleted saves episode if I didn't mention how the gaming journalists reviewed Helldivers II. While I personally don't care what the critics think, and I think we all know how Phil feels about them, I do believe that there are sometimes insights to be gained by viewing the review landscape. Interestingly, despite all its flaws and controversy, which would normally act as bait for the critics, Helldivers II has been consistently well rated. There have certainly been plenty of articles written on the controversy, but very few outlets have changed their score, or if they did, like many individual gamers, they put it back once the boycott was concluded. As of recording this, most of the scores are at 80 out of 100, with a fair number being 90 or higher. And while things can change, as we've seen, and of course we don't care what those critics think, for me, it does feel good to get that bit of confirmation that when I tell people it's a good game, I'm not an outlier with a controversial opinion. And in a world where the next injection-molded Call of Duty or Assassin's Creed gets 8s and 9s and 10s, we can sometimes get the impression that we're the weird ones. All in all, I'd say that I think Helldivers II is special and deserves a look from anyone who enjoys guns and explosions. And it's not even as big of a risk, since the base price is $40 US. I know not everyone will get the same value out of it as I have, but these days when we're getting games that are just as buggy, and in a lot of ways worse, for upwards of $70, I think that the price tag alone is enough to warrant a look. Thank you for listening. As I said at the beginning, I'm Brad, a.k.a. Isekai Sensei-Sama. And yes, I'm that Brad, one of the patrons that Phil thanks at the end of every episode, along with Keith Gasper, Orden Wells, and Mass Llama. I've been a patron for a long time because deleted saves is great, and I think you should be one too. But you should also check out my podcast, That Time I Got Reincarnated in the Same World as an Anime Podcaster, which is an anime and manga podcast, if you couldn't tell. We've actually got a few different shows on our feed, so there's something for everyone. You can find out more by going to our website, animepodcasterreincarnation.com. We actually had Phil on as a guest a while back, so if you've ever wanted to hear him in a longer discussion and interview style, be sure to check that out. I want to thank Phil for letting me have this opportunity to talk about something I'm really into, since it's not really a subject that fits on my shows. And once again, I'd like to thank you for listening.